I'd been hiking since sunrise, cutting through thick forest with little more than my backpack, a few supplies, and a rough trail map. I'd hoped to reach the peak before sundown, but I miscalculated. The sky was a bruised purple now, and darkness was creeping in fast. Worse, my phone was out of range, and I hadn't seen any markers or signs for hours. I tried to tell myself I wasn't lost, just taking the scenic route. But when the wind began to pick up, rustling the leaves around me with a sound like faint whispers, I couldn't ignore the uneasy prickling at the back of my neck. Panic was beginning to set in when, through the trees, I saw it. A cabin. Nestled between two large oaks, its weathered wooden structure seemed to beckon me with the promise of warmth and shelter. And right now, shelter was all I could think about. The cold was seeping through my jacket, and I had no desire to spend a night exposed in the middle of nowhere. As I approached, I noticed a strange glow emanating from the cabin, a faint reddish light that pulsed like a heartbeat. It seemed to come from a single window near the front, casting an eerie, blood-colored hue over the clearing around it. For a moment, I hesitated. What kind of light was that? And why was it the only source of illumination in an otherwise pitch-dark forest? But it was getting colder, and my limbs were aching from the long hike. The idea of resting, even for a few minutes, was too tempting. Besides, it was probably just someone's hunting cabin, or maybe even an old ranger station. They might have supplies or a map. I climbed the creaky steps and reached for the door, feeling a pang of guilt for trespassing. But it was unlocked, so I pushed it open, calling out a tentative, "Hello?" No answer. I stepped inside, feeling a strange sense of relief mixed with unease. The room was small and mostly empty, save for an old wooden table in the center, a rickety chair beside it, and a few scattered items: a faded rug, a dusty lantern, and some empty cans stacked in one corner. The red light was coming from the other side of the room, filtering through the only window. I still couldn't tell what was causing it. It seemed almost otherworldly. I glanced around, hoping to find a switch or lamp, but there was nothing. I took off my backpack, set it on the table, and sat down in the chair, trying to shake off the chill in my bones. Maybe I'd rest here for just a few minutes and then keep moving. I closed my eyes, breathing deeply to calm myself. But as soon as I settled, I heard it, the unmistakable sound of a lock clicking shut behind me. My eyes snapped open, and I turned around to see the door, now firmly closed. I could have sworn I hadn't closed it all the way. I got up, heart pounding, and reached for the handle, but it wouldn't budge. I pulled harder, jiggling the knob, but it was as if the door was welded shut. Panic rose in my chest. I hadn't noticed a lock when I came in. There was no deadbolt, no visible latch. But here I was, trapped. I took a step back, trying to catch my breath. The red light flickered, then went out. In the sudden darkness, I felt an instinctual terror, like I was standing at the edge of a cliff in the dark. I fumbled for my phone, hoping to use its flashlight, but the screen remained black, unresponsive. And then I heard it, a whisper, low, almost inaudible, but unmistakable. It was my name. Sam. I froze, heart thudding in my ears. I hadn't told anyone I'd be here, hadn't even passed another hiker on the trail. So who could possibly know my name? I held my breath, straining to hear. The whispering continued, soft and insistent, coming from somewhere deeper in the cabin. I stepped forward, feeling my way along the wall, searching for anything familiar. A light switch, a candle, anything to give me a sense of my surroundings. But as I moved, something brushed past me. It was so faint that at first I thought I'd imagined it. But then it happened again. A cold, feather-light touch, almost like a hand gliding across my arm. "Who's there?" I whispered, my voice sounding small and frightened in the suffocating darkness. Silence. I took a deep breath, willing myself to stay calm. My hands found the edge of the table, grounding me. But then I noticed something odd. The table felt different. The surface was rough and splintered, the wood warped and damp. I distinctly remembered the table being smooth when I first entered. I could feel the sensation under my fingers, rough and strangely sticky, as though the wood was rotting. The air grew thick with a damp, musty odor, like mildew mixed with something metallic. I pulled my hand back, feeling the sticky residue cling to my skin. My pulse raced as I wiped it on my jeans, but the smell lingered. And then the whisper returned. "Sam, you remember, don't you?" The voice was closer this time, softer, but more insistent. And there was something familiar about it, something that tugged at a distant memory, like a fragment of a dream, slipping through my fingers. I shook my head, trying to banish the thought. But the voice continued, murmuring words I couldn't quite understand. It was as if it were speaking directly into my mind, probing for something, searching. The air grew colder, and I felt a presence, something standing right behind me. I dared not turn around, afraid of what I might see. I squeezed my eyes shut, willing myself to wake up from whatever nightmare I'd fallen into. But the whisper grew louder, and this time I understood the words. "Do you remember the promise, Sam?" The promise. My mind raced, trying to make sense of it. There was no promise, no reason for me to be here, in this God-forsaken cabin, with a voice that knew my name. And yet, a part of me, a dark, hidden part, felt a vague recognition, a flicker of memory. I opened my eyes and turned slowly, knowing I would see something there. But the cabin was empty. I took a shuddering breath and moved toward the window, hoping to see some sign of the red light, some reminder of reality. But when I looked outside, there was nothing but darkness, an inky, endless void, stretching out in every direction. The trees, the trail, the forest itself, gone. It was as if the cabin had been swallowed by a black abyss, suspended in nothingness. Suddenly, I felt a searing pain in my head, like a spike driving through my skull. Images flashed before my eyes, blurred, distorted memories of this cabin. But the walls were cleaner, the table polished, a fire crackling in a stone fireplace that wasn't here now. I saw myself sitting at that table, laughing with someone. A figure shrouded in shadow, their face obscured. But as the memory faded, the figure turned to me, their eyes glowing red in the darkness, and whispered, "You promised." The pain receded, leaving me gasping. I staggered back, pressing my hands to my temples, struggling to breathe. I didn't remember. I didn't know this place. But the cabin seemed to pulse with that familiar, terrible energy, as if it were alive, as if it were waiting. The red light flickered back to life, casting a faint glow across the room, and I saw them, shadows gathering in the corners, shifting, forming vague shapes that twisted and contorted. And in the center of it all was the figure from my vision, staring at me with those awful red eyes, their voice echoing in my mind. "You can't leave, Sam. Not until you remember." I stumbled backward, pressing myself against the wall, but the shadows seemed to close in around me. The red-eyed figure stepped closer, and I could feel the chill emanating from them, a deep, bone-chilling cold that sapped the strength from my limbs. "What do you want from me?" I managed to choke out, my voice barely a whisper. The figure tilted its head, almost as if it were amused, and the shadows around it writhed in response. "Only what you promised, Sam," it replied, its voice like shattered glass scraping through my mind. "You came back, just like you said you would, and now you're ours." The shadows surged forward, enveloping me in darkness. The red light flickered, growing brighter, pulsing with each beat of my heart. I felt my strength draining, my mind slipping as the memories came flooding back. Memories of that night, years ago, when I had sat in this very cabin and made a pact I could barely comprehend. A pact for power, for knowledge, for freedom from fear. But the cost. The cost had been a piece of me, a piece of my soul bound to this place, bound to them. And now, they were here to collect. As the shadows closed over me, I felt myself slipping away, my body growing numb, my mind sinking into darkness. And the last thing I heard before I was swallowed completely was the voice, whispering in my ear, a final reminder of the promise I could never escape. I tried to scream, but the sound was swallowed by the shadows pressing in on me. My body felt like it was trapped in cold, thick sludge, every movement slow, every breath painful. The red light pulsed again, casting a dull glow that illuminated the figure with those piercing crimson eyes. Their gaze bored into me, filled with a dark satisfaction, as if they had been waiting for this moment, for me, for a very long time. "Please," I whispered, barely able to force the words past my trembling lips. "I don't remember. I don't understand. Let me go." The figure didn't answer right away. Instead, they tilted their head, watching me with that strange, patient amusement. Then, slowly, they reached out, their hand stretching forward, fingers impossibly long, twisting and curling like smoke. When they touched my cheek, it was colder than ice, and I felt it burn deep into my skin. A dark, clawing pain sank into my bones, a pain so intense that I thought I might pass out. "You made your choice long ago, Sam," the voice hissed, each word slithering through my mind like poison. "And choices have consequences. Do you think we wait forever?" The words sent a shiver through me, dredging up memories that felt half-formed, hidden under layers of denial and repression. I remembered that night, the feeling of desperation, the drive to escape my own fear. I had come here once before, alone, seeking something. I hadn't been myself then, and I could barely remember why. But the ache, the fear that had led me here, it all began to resurface. I glanced around, my vision starting to blur, the room seeming to shift and warp around me. The cabin no longer looked like an old, abandoned shelter. Instead, I saw it in glimpses, a place of warmth with candles, food, and laughter. I remembered sitting here, bargaining with the darkness that lived in this place, making promises to things I could barely comprehend. I had wanted power over my own fears, to feel invincible, even if just for a moment. And I had made my pact. The figure leaned closer, their breath cold against my skin. "You belong to us now. You came back, just like you said you would." My mind raced, but it felt slippery, ungraspable. I was being pulled into the past, reliving every detail, every foolish word. The memories flickered and faded like a twisted, sinister movie playing before my eyes. I remembered my desperation, my reckless need to feel something beyond my own limits. And I remembered making the pact, shaking hands with the figure in the shadows, sealing the deal with a promise of my return. "I didn't know," I gasped, my voice cracking. I didn't understand what I was agreeing to. The figure's laughter was a soft, chilling echo that filled the cabin, reverberating off the walls. And yet, here you are, just as you promised, returning to the place where it all began. The walls seemed to close in around me, the space shrinking, suffocating. I tried to back away, to find some escape, but there was nowhere to go. The cabin felt like a cage, and the red light grew brighter, casting shadows that danced and twisted, forming shapes that looked like hands reaching for me, like faces hidden in darkness, eyes watching, hungry and unblinking. I staggered back, pressing myself against the wall, my heart pounding in my chest like a drumbeat, echoing the rhythm of the pulsing red light. I could feel the shadows closing in, their cold, grasping fingers brushing against my skin, tugging at me, pulling me toward the center of the room. And then I heard a voice, fainter, softer than before, but different from the others. It sounded familiar. It was a voice I hadn't heard in years, a voice I thought I had forgotten. My own. I remembered something, a fragment of a moment, a piece of the past. It was me, standing here, alone, a younger version of myself, looking into the darkness, feeling the weight of my own fear and loneliness. I remembered whispering to the shadows, asking them for help, begging for some way to be free of everything that terrified me. And I remembered the promise I had made, the one I thought would never matter. If I ever come back here, I'm yours. I had said it without thinking, without believing. It was a desperate, foolish attempt to bargain with something I didn't understand. But the shadows had listened. They had taken my words as truth, binding me to this place, to them. The figure in front of me leaned closer, their crimson eyes gleaming with dark amusement. "Promises bind us, Sam. They give us power. You are ours now, just as you said you would be." The shadows twisted around me, tightening like a noose. I felt myself slipping away, my mind unraveling, my body growing colder. I tried to resist, to fight, but it was like trying to move underwater. Every action slow, every thought fading. I wanted to scream, to beg, but my voice felt weak, distant, like I was sinking into a dream from which I'd never wake. The figure's eyes burned into me, pulling me deeper, consuming me. And then, in a final desperate act, I forced myself to remember. I closed my eyes and thought of the forest, of the trail, of the life waiting for me outside this cursed place. I thought of every moment I had left behind, every person I had ever loved, every dream I had yet to fulfill. "I don't belong to you," I whispered, my voice barely more than a breath. The figure's eyes narrowed, their smile fading. The shadows around me wavered, hesitating. I took a deep breath, gathering the last remnants of my strength, and forced myself to stand. "You may have tricked me once, but I'm not the same person I was then. I'm stronger now. I won't let you take me." The red light flickered, dimming, and I felt the shadows retreat, just a little, as if they were uncertain, as if they were losing their hold on me. But the figure's eyes remained steady, their gaze unyielding. "You can't escape what you are, Sam. You made your choice, and choices have consequences." The room began to spin, the walls warping and bending, the shadows swirling around me in a chaotic storm. But I held my ground, focusing on that faint glimmer of hope, that spark of defiance that refused to die. And slowly, Painfully, the darkness began to recede. The red light faded, the shadows withdrew, and I found myself standing alone in the cabin, the figure gone, the room silent. I staggered toward the door, my heart pounding, my body trembling. My hand reached for the handle, and this time, it turned easily. The door swung open, and I stumbled out into the night, the cold air hitting me like a slap, filling my lungs with a sharp, painful clarity. I looked back at the cabin, half expecting to see those crimson eyes watching me from the window. But there was nothing. The red light was gone, the cabin dark and silent. I took a shaky breath, my mind reeling, my body aching. I didn't know what had just happened, or how I had escaped. But I knew one thing. I would never come back to this place. I would never make that mistake again. As I turned and walked away, the forest around me seemed to sigh, as if releasing a long-held breath. The path before me was clear, leading me back to the world I had almost lost. But as I walked, I felt a faint, lingering presence, a whisper on the edge of my mind, a reminder of the darkness that would always be with me, a part of me, bound by the promise I had made so many years ago. And in the depths of my mind, I heard the voice, softer now, but still there, waiting. Until next time, Sam. I shivered, quickening my pace, hoping that next time would never come. I was somewhere in the middle of Nebraska, driving a lonely stretch of highway, with nothing but static on the radio and the hum of my engine to keep me company. The night felt endless. My headlights barely cut through the blackness around me, and the line of the road seemed to vanish into the void ahead. This solo road trip was supposed to clear my mind. I'd been wrestling with stress from work, family tension, and a breakup that still gnawed at me, even though I pretended otherwise. I wanted the open road, something uncomplicated. But out here, the silence pressed in, heavy and unsettling, like the night was holding its breath. The GPS had been guiding me faithfully since morning, but somewhere past midnight, it blipped. I glanced at the screen, hoping it was just a glitch, but the little blue dot had frozen, hovering in the middle of a gray grid. Then a message popped up, recalculating, followed by an ominous, "No signal detected." "Great," I muttered, trying not to panic. There was supposed to be a gas station a few miles up ahead. I could stop there and wait it out if I had to. But after another 20 minutes of driving, there was no station, just an endless stretch of road and pitch-black fields on either side. I was beginning to wonder if I'd missed it when the GPS chimed back to life with a new route. I looked down in surprise. It showed an arrow for an upcoming turn. I squinted at the screen, unsure of where it was leading me. It wasn't part of my original route, but maybe it was a shortcut. And at this hour, a shorter route back to civilization sounded like a gift. I took the turn without another thought, and the road narrowed, flanked by tall grasses that brushed against my car as I drove. The pavement turned to gravel, then dirt. Soon, trees were closing in on both sides, their branches forming an almost suffocating canopy overhead. My headlights cut through the dense foliage, casting long, twisted shadows that seemed to move as I passed. A chill ran through me, and I instinctively turned up the heat. That's when I heard it, a faint crackling coming from the radio. I hadn't touched it all night, but now static hissed from the speakers, punctuated by occasional pops and clicks. I frowned, reaching to turn it off, but as my hand brushed the knob, a faint voice crackled through the static. "Sam, don't..." The voice was almost lost in the noise, but I could have sworn it said my name. My hand froze on the dial, heart pounding. It had to be a fluke, some random radio signal picking up static in the middle of nowhere. "Hello?" I asked, feeling ridiculous for speaking into the radio. Only static responded. I shook my head, chalking it up to exhaustion. But as I continued down the narrow road, the voice returned, a little louder this time. "Sam, turn back." The blood drained from my face. My name again, clearer this time, followed by a warning. A chill crept up my spine, my hand tightening on the wheel. I forced myself to breathe, telling myself it was nothing but my mind playing tricks on me. I'd been driving too long, needed sleep. But the voice came back, clearer still. "Don't go further, Sam." I yanked my hand away from the radio, as if it had burned me, my pulse pounding. Who could possibly know my name out here? I tried to rationalize it. A strange coincidence, a broadcast glitch. But it felt wrong, deeply wrong, like I was somehow known in a way I couldn't explain. The road curved sharply, and as I turned, my headlights swept over an old, crumbling sign, half hidden by overgrown weeds. The words were faded, but I could still make them out. Bloomfield, 5 miles. I didn't remember seeing Bloomfield on any map, but I kept driving. I was exhausted, alone, and beginning to feel as if I didn't have much choice. The road wound on, twisting through dense trees that leaned in like they wanted to keep me there. My grip tightened on the wheel, and I tried to focus on the drive, refusing to look at the radio. But the static persisted, and the voice returned, almost pleading. "Please, Sam, leave." My foot pressed harder on the gas, a reflex born out of fear. I just wanted to get through this stretch of road, find the town, and put some distance between myself and whatever was happening on the radio. But then, faintly, through the static, I heard a melody start to play. I blinked, my mind racing as I recognized it. A warped, scratchy version of an old lullaby, one I hadn't heard in years. It was the same lullaby my mom used to sing when I was a kid, when I couldn't sleep. I felt an odd mix of comfort and dread, a strange sense of familiarity. But as I listened, the lyrics changed. "Hush, little baby. Don't say a word." The melody warped, slowing down, each note dripping with something ominous. "Hush, little baby. You shouldn't have come." The lullaby twisted into something darker, distorted, as if someone was singing it just for me, warning me to leave. I slammed on the brakes, my car skidding to a stop. My headlights illuminated the road ahead, an endless tunnel of trees, stretching into darkness. I was starting to feel as if I'd driven straight out of the world I knew. I tried turning the radio off, but the button wouldn't budge. The song kept playing, slow and haunting, growing louder with each warped verse. I felt trapped, like something was holding me in place, refusing to let me go. My hands shook as I gripped the steering wheel, breathing hard. Then the radio hissed, the static almost deafening, and the voice returned. "You shouldn't be here." The words stretched out, like they were being dragged from a great distance. But this time, it didn't sound like a warning. It sounded like a threat. Panic clawed at me, and I threw the car into reverse, determined to backtrack, get off this cursed road, and find my way back to the highway. But no matter how far I reversed, the landscape never changed. The road looked exactly the same, endless, with no signs, no turnoffs. The trees seemed to close in tighter, pressing against the car, their branches scraping against the windows, like skeletal fingers. Then, in the distance, I saw a light, small, flickering. Hope surged through me. Maybe it was a gas station or a house, somewhere with people who could help. I drove toward it, my heart racing as I approached. But as I got closer, I realized it wasn't a gas station. It was a tiny, abandoned diner, the kind you'd see in old movies. A crooked neon sign hung over the entrance, one of the letters flickering in and out. It read, "Welcome." My stomach twisted. I parked, staring at the sign as dread settled over me. I didn't want to go inside, but something compelled me, a pull I couldn't explain. I stepped out of the car, the cold night air prickling my skin. The diner looked like it hadn't been touched in decades. The windows were dark, the tables inside covered in dust, but I could see a faint glow from within, as if something was alive in there, watching me. The door creaked as I pushed it open, and I stepped inside. It was silent except for the low hum of the jukebox in the corner. I stared, transfixed, as it flickered to life, casting the room in an eerie glow. And then, just as I thought I was alone, I heard it. My name. Sam. I froze, looking around, but the diner was empty. My pulse quickened as the voice called again, soft and low. Sam, you're home. The jukebox crackled, and the warped lullaby started to play once more, filling the diner with its haunting melody. I backed toward the door, desperate to leave, but when I tried the handle, it wouldn't budge. I was trapped. And then, in the booth nearest to the jukebox, I saw it. A shadowy figure, their face obscured in darkness. They were sitting, motionless, their eyes fixed on me. "We've been waiting for you, Sam," the figure whispered, their voice smooth and cold. "So long?" I felt a wave of nausea, a primal urge to run, but my legs wouldn't move. I was frozen, locked in place, as the figure's gaze held me. "Stay a while," the figure murmured, gesturing to the seat across from them. "After all, you've been here before." A chill washed over me. I shook my head, unable to find my voice. The figure's smile widened, a gleam of teeth in the dim light. "Did you think you could leave us? That you could forget?" The door slammed behind me, and the jukebox hissed, the static filling the diner with its oppressive weight. The shadows deepened, swirling around the figure, around me until everything faded into black. When I opened my eyes, I was back in my car, parked by the side of the road. The diner was gone, the GPS blank. I sat there, breathless, my hands shaking as I started the engine and sped off. But as I drove, the static returned, faint but insistent, and I could have sworn I heard my name, whispered softly, over and over. "Sam, Sam, welcome home." The clearing appeared out of nowhere, an unexpected break in the dense woods that had surrounded me for miles. I'd been hiking alone for most of the day, following a barely visible trail through the underbrush. I was tired, hungry, and more than ready to set up camp. When I stumbled into the clearing, the last rays of the sun slanting through the trees, I almost sighed in relief. But that relief was short-lived. At the center of the clearing stood an old, weathered stone well. It was odd. No structures or cabins in sight. No nearby trails, marked on my map. Yet, here was this old, crumbling well, nestled right in the middle of nowhere. Curiosity pulled me forward. I found myself walking toward it, each step echoing in the eerie silence that had settled over the clearing, even the usual sounds of the forest. Chirping insects, rustling leaves, distant bird calls had faded away, leaving a stillness that made the hairs on the back of my neck prickle. As I got closer, I noticed something strange. A faint blue light seemed to be emanating from deep within the well. It wasn't a steady glow, but more like a pulse, flickering in and out, as if something alive was breathing beneath the stone. I should have turned back right then, set up camp somewhere far from that strange clearing. But instead, I felt compelled to look closer, like the well had its own gravity, pulling me toward it. I reached the edge and peered over, my hands gripping the cold stone rim. The blue light was much clearer now, swirling like mist deep within the well's darkness. And then, as I looked down, I saw it, a face staring back at me, deep in the shadows. I blinked, startled, but the face remained, clear as day. It was my own reflection, but there was something wrong with it. The face in the well looked older, hollowed out, with eyes that were darker, almost hungry. The reflection's mouth moved, silently mouthing words I couldn't understand, words that seemed to reverberate in my head like whispers. I jerked back, heart pounding, a cold sweat breaking out on my skin. I took a deep breath, willing myself to calm down, to brush it off as a trick of the light or my imagination playing with shadows. But as I stepped back, I felt a strange compulsion to look again, a tugging deep inside, urging me to return to the well. I resisted at first, forcing myself to take another step back. But that pull only grew stronger, insistent, whispering in my mind like an itch I couldn't scratch. Finally, against my better judgment, I leaned over the well's edge once more. The face was still there, watching me with an intensity that made my skin crawl. But this time, it wasn't just staring. It was moving. My reflection, no, the figure in the well, lifted a hand slowly, almost as if in a wave. I felt a strange tingling in my arm, and horrified, I realized I was lifting my hand in response, mirroring the gesture. My hand moved of its own accord, rising in sync with the reflections, as if pulled by invisible strings. A low, shuddering breath escaped me. My fingers met the cold stone rim of the well, and then, with a force I couldn't resist, my hand began to reach further, stretching toward the darkness below. The figure's mouth moved again, and this time, I heard it. A faint whisper, almost too soft to understand. Come. Closer. The voice wasn't mine. It was deeper, hollow, filled with something ancient and unyielding. I tried to pull back, to tear my gaze away, but my body refused to listen. It was as if the well had me in its grip, holding me captive with that strange pulsing light. My hand continued to reach into the darkness, fingers slipping over the edge of the well and dangling in the cold air. I felt nothing below, only an endless void that seemed to go on forever. And then, something brushed against my fingers, light, almost gentle, like a whisper of wind. But it was cold, impossibly cold, and it seemed to sink into my skin, spreading up my arm in an icy wave. I felt a prickling sensation, like pins and needles, numbing my hand, crawling up toward my shoulder. I tried to yank my arm back, but my body still wouldn't respond. Panic rose in my chest as I watched my reflection's mouth move again, repeating the same words over and over, each time growing louder. Come. Closer. The numbness spread further, reaching my chest, chilling my lungs with each breath. I felt like I was sinking, being pulled down into the well, into that dark, endless pit beneath the stone. I clenched my teeth, summoning every ounce of strength I had, and managed to take a single step back. The spell broke. My arm jerked free and I stumbled away from the well, gasping for air. My fingers tingled painfully as feeling returned, but I barely noticed. My heart was hammering so loudly I thought it might burst. I backed away further, eyes still fixed on the well, half expecting the reflection to crawl out after me. But the surface was calm, the blue light fading back into shadows. The whispers stopped, and an eerie silence settled over the clearing once more. I turned, ready to leave, but as I moved, I caught something in the corner of my eye. On the ground by my feet was a long, dark line of damp earth, trailing from the well to where I stood. I stared, my mind reeling. There hadn't been any water in the well, yet here it was, a trail of wet earth, as if something had crawled out and followed me. My heart pounded faster. I couldn't stay here. I needed to leave, now. I picked up my backpack and started back toward the edge of the clearing, but every step felt like wading through thick, cold mud. The trees around me seemed to grow taller, darker, as if closing in, trapping me. I forced myself to keep moving, one step at a time, refusing to look back. But then, just as I reached the edge of the clearing, I heard it again. My name, whispered softly, floating through the silence. Sam. I froze. It was the same voice, hollow and distant, yet unmistakably real. I turned, against my better judgment, and saw the well glowing faintly again, the blue light flickering like a candle in the wind. The clearing seemed darker, the air colder, as if the night itself was pressing down, urging me to leave. But the voice continued, persistent, echoing in my mind. Come back. I took another step back, forcing myself to turn away, but the voice only grew louder, more desperate. Sam, don't leave me here. My breath caught. The voice sounded familiar now, softer, almost pleading. It was a voice I hadn't heard in years, a voice that belonged to someone I'd lost long ago, someone I had loved. My mind reeled, and I felt an ache in my chest, an old wound opening up, raw and painful. The voice called again, and this time, it was unmistakable. It was my mother's voice, clear and soft, calling me as she used to when I was a child. Sam, come back. I shook my head, tears pricking my eyes. This couldn't be real. She was gone, had been gone for years. This was some kind of trick, something the well was using to lure me back. But the voice continued, weaving through my thoughts, filling me with a longing so deep it hurt. Please, don't leave me here, Sam. I found myself turning again, taking a step toward the well. My mother's voice was calling me, and I couldn't ignore it. She sounded so real, so close, as if she were right there, waiting for me just a few steps away. But then, another voice, softer and quieter, whispered in the back of my mind. A memory, faint, but strong enough to hold me back. It isn't her. The realization hit me like a punch to the gut, and I staggered back, horror flooding through me. The well wasn't calling me. Something inside it was. Something that knew my deepest memories, my oldest wounds. It was using them to draw me closer, to pull me in. With a shuddering breath, I turned away from the well and forced myself to walk, one step at a time, back through the trees. The voice continued to call, growing fainter, fading into a low, mournful whisper. My chest ached with each step, but I kept moving, refusing to look back. When I finally broke free of the clearing, The sounds of the forest returned. The chirping of insects, the rustle of leaves, the distant calls of birds. I didn't stop until I was far away, until the trees had swallowed the clearing and the well entirely. But even as I set up camp that night, miles away from that strange, lonely place, I couldn't shake the feeling that I'd left something behind. And as I lay in my tent, listening to the wind whisper through the trees, I thought I could still hear her voice, faint and distant, calling to me from somewhere deep in the forest. "Come back, Sam. Please." I covered my ears, willing myself to forget, to ignore the longing that tugged at my heart. But I knew, deep down, that I'd never really escape. The clock on my dashboard read 11:58 p.m. as I navigated a lonely road miles away from the nearest town. My eyelids were heavy, and I'd been fighting to stay awake for the last hour. I hadn't planned on driving so late, but one wrong turn after another had led me deep into unfamiliar territory. The moon was hidden by thick clouds, and my headlights barely illuminated the narrow road ahead. My phone had long lost signal, and I'd seen no signs of civilization for miles. I wasn't even sure which state line I'd crossed last. Just endless woods on both sides of me, a black ribbon of road stretching ahead, the trees leaning over the road like they were trying to swallow it whole. I was about to pull over to catch a few hours of sleep in the car, when, just as my clock clicked over to midnight, I saw it. A house, standing alone in a clearing just off the road. 2 stories, with a wraparound porch and large windows glowing warmly in the night. It looked inviting. Strange, yes, in the middle of nowhere, but comforting somehow, like it was waiting for me. I parked the car on the gravel driveway, hesitated, then grabbed my backpack and made my way to the porch. The boards creaked under my weight as I approached the front door. There was a brass knocker shaped like a lion's head, polished so cleanly it gleamed even in the dim moonlight. I reached out, feeling a strange compulsion to knock. My hand hesitated over it, my skin prickling with an odd, creeping sensation. Instead, I pushed the door, and it swung open silently. The warm glow from inside spilled out, and I stepped inside, closing the door gently behind me. The house was filled with an old-fashioned charm, a grand staircase in the foyer, dark wood paneling on the walls, chandeliers casting a dim but cozy light. "Hello?" I called out, half expecting a caretaker or an owner to appear. Nothing. Silence settled over the house, thick and still. But there was a strange sense of familiarity here, as though I'd been in this exact place before. Each piece of furniture, every detail, felt like an echo of a memory I couldn't quite place. I told myself it was just my mind playing tricks. I was exhausted and grateful to have stumbled on shelter. I'd just rest for a few hours on one of the chairs in the foyer and leave at first light. I set my backpack down, slumping into a worn leather armchair near a fireplace. There was no fire, but the warmth from somewhere deeper in the house was enough. The grandfather clock in the corner of the room caught my eye. It was a beautiful piece, finely crafted, with a dark mahogany finish. The time was frozen at 12:01, the second hand twitching, as if trapped in that moment. I shook my head, unsettled, but too tired to dwell on it. I closed my eyes, leaning back in the chair, and let out a long, exhausted sigh. I could feel sleep pulling at me, soft and insistent, and I was on the edge of drifting off when I heard it. A faint whisper. "Sam." My eyes flew open, my heart pounding. I glanced around the empty room, the shadows stretching out from the corners. No one was there, but the whisper hung in the air, soft and insistent. "Sam, you came back." The voice was low, familiar but twisted, like it was coming from a memory buried deep in my mind. I tried to convince myself it was just my imagination, but the feeling of being watched was unmistakable. I pushed myself up from the chair, suddenly feeling cold. I decided to explore the house a bit, hoping that movement would ease my nerves. As I wandered down a dimly lit hallway, I noticed framed photographs hanging on the walls. They were old, sepia-toned images of people in vintage clothing, their expressions frozen in somber stares. But as I looked closer, a shiver ran down my spine. The people in the photographs, they looked like me. Not exactly, but close enough to make my skin crawl. Each face shared some feature with mine, a similar set of eyes, a familiar smile. And each of them wore the same haunted expression, as if they'd seen something that had left them forever changed. I took a step back, feeling my pulse quicken. The hallway stretched longer now, winding farther into the house than it had seemed from the outside. I tried to turn back, but when I looked over my shoulder, the foyer was gone, replaced by another long corridor, lined with even more photographs. Panic started to settle in, cold and sharp, as I moved forward, my footsteps echoing in the silence. The house felt alive. The walls seemed to close in around me, and the lights flickered, casting strange shadows that danced along the walls. As I passed one of the mirrors in the hall, I caught a glimpse of myself, or what I thought was myself. My reflection didn't move with me. Instead, it stared back, unblinking, with an expression of silent dread. I froze, staring at it, heart pounding. The reflection's lips moved, forming a single silent word. "Run!" I staggered back, stumbling into the wall. My reflection's face remained frozen in terror, and I turned, desperate to find a way out. But the hallway seemed to stretch endlessly in both directions, twisting and looping in impossible ways. I was trapped in a maze, every turn leading to another identical hallway, lined with those haunting, familiar faces. The whispers started again, soft at first, then growing louder, filling my ears, wrapping around me like a shroud. "Sam, you promised. You promised." The words repeated, overlapping, a chorus of voices, all whispering my name, accusing, pleading. I broke into a run, my footsteps echoing, but no matter how far I ran, the house only seemed to grow larger, the hallways more twisted, more labyrinthine. Every door I tried was locked, every window sealed. The walls felt like they were shifting around me, the house itself alive, trapping me within its endless halls. Finally, I burst into a room that was different from the rest. It was a small parlor, furnished with a single chair and a table set with tea for one. And sitting at the table was me. The figure looked up, meeting my gaze with dark, hollow eyes. It was me, but older, worn down, as though he'd been here for years. His clothes were faded, his skin pale, and his eyes held a look of resignation, as though he'd given up long ago. "You can't leave," he said, his voice hollow. "You made a promise." I shook my head, backing away. "I don't understand. What promise?" The figure stood, moving closer, his steps slow and deliberate. "You don't remember, do you?" he asked, a sad smile creeping onto his face. "This house, you've been here before. We all have." He gestured to the walls, and I followed his gaze. The walls were covered in photographs, all of them showing different versions of me, each one slightly older, each one more worn, each one with that same haunted expression. "We're all pieces of you," he continued, his voice soft, almost pitying. Each one of us came here, thinking we were just passing through, but the house doesn't let you go. I tried to turn, to run, but my feet wouldn't move. The house seemed to hold me in place, the air thickening around me, pressing down with a weight that felt like centuries of memory, loss, and broken promises. What does it want? I managed to choke out, my throat dry. The figure reached out, placing a cold hand on my shoulder. It wants you to remember, he said, his eyes filling with a dark sadness. It wants you to keep the promise. As he spoke, the memories flooded back, a fractured, fragmented vision of a night just like this one, years ago, when I had stumbled upon this house for the first time. I remembered walking these halls, seeing those same faces, hearing those same whispers, and I remembered making a promise, a foolish, desperate promise to come back. My heart sank as I realized the truth. The house had let me go once, but only because it knew I would return. And now, it was claiming me, pulling me back into its endless halls, where I would be just another version, another echo, trapped within its walls. I tried to pull away, to break free, but the figure's grip tightened, his hollow eyes filled with an empty, resigned despair. You're part of the house now, he whispered, just like all the others. The whispers grew louder, filling the room, and I felt myself fading, sinking into the darkness, becoming part of the endless echo, the broken promise that bound me to this place. And as the house swallowed me whole, I realized that there was no escape, that I would be here forever, just another face in the endless hallways, waiting for the next version of myself to arrive, waiting for the next promise to be broken. The detour sign appeared suddenly, planted haphazardly on the shoulder of the road. It was old and faded, nearly blending into the dark night, and I almost missed it as I drove down that deserted stretch of highway. My GPS had gone out about 30 miles back, leaving me driving blind in an unfamiliar area. I'd been hoping to hit the main road again, but this detour was the first indication of civilization I'd seen in hours. I turned onto the narrow road, figuring it would eventually lead back to a town where I could regroup and find my way. The road was thin and winding, hemmed in by dense trees. It felt unnatural. No other cars, no streetlights, not even a glimmer of moonlight to break through the thick branches overhead. After 10 minutes of driving in silence, a prickling unease began to settle over me. The trees seemed to loom closer, their shadows merging with the road itself, and the darkness felt so thick I could almost feel it pressing against the windows. As I rounded yet another sharp turn, the trees parted, and I saw it, a town, nestled quietly in the valley below. The road wound down toward it like a ribbon, and lights dotted the landscape, casting an eerie glow across the old-fashioned buildings. I couldn't believe my luck. I hadn't seen anything for miles, and now, here was a town. Relief washed over me as I drove toward it, my tires crunching over gravel as I passed a sign at the edge of town that read, "Welcome to Ashbrook." The buildings along the main street looked like they'd been frozen in time. Victorian houses, a small church with a crooked steeple, a general store, and a row of small shops lined the street. I couldn't see any people, but lights glowed warmly in several windows, giving the impression that the town was inhabited, but sleeping. I parked my car along the main street and stepped out, the silence hitting me like a physical weight. No sounds of nightlife, no hum of streetlights, just the soft whistle of the wind and the occasional creak of a distant door. As I closed the car door, I noticed an old diner across the street with a neon open sign flickering in the window. A soft, orange glow seeped out from behind the dusty glass, casting strange shadows on the sidewalk. The sight was oddly comforting in the unsettling stillness, and the thought of coffee and maybe a bit of company drew me forward. The bell above the door jingled as I pushed it open, the sound jarringly loud in the silent night. Inside, the diner looked as if it had been pulled straight out of a 1950s postcard. Red vinyl booths lined the walls, and a long counter with swiveling stools stretched out along one side. A vintage jukebox sat in the corner, and a clock hung on the wall, its hands stuck at 2:17. I walked to the counter, glancing around. No one was there, but a coffee cup sat on the counter, steam still curling up from the surface. I felt an odd chill. Someone had been here, recently. I cleared my throat. "Hello?" I called out. For a moment there was nothing but silence. Then, a door behind the counter creaked open, and an old man stepped out. He was thin and pale, with deep lines etched into his face, and his eyes were shadowed, almost sunken. He nodded to me with a faint, unsettling smile. "Evening," he said, his voice low and raspy. I tried to shake off my nerves and smiled politely. Hey, I think I might be lost. My GPS went out, and I've been driving for hours. Do you know how I could get back to the main highway?" The old man's expression didn't change. He just looked at me with those hollow eyes and shook his head slowly. "There's only one road out of Ashbrook," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "Just keep driving, son. It'll take you where you need to go." Something about the way he said it sent a shiver down my spine. I nodded, eager to leave, and backed toward the door. But as I reached for the handle, he spoke again. "You'd best be on your way before dark," he said, his voice dropping even lower. "Ashbrook isn't kind to strangers after nightfall." I turned, ready to ask him what he meant, but he had disappeared, vanished into the shadows behind the counter as if he'd never been there. I left the diner, feeling the weight of his words pressing down on me. The town felt darker now, the light from the street lamps casting long shadows that seemed to stretch toward me. I climbed back into my car, starting the engine and following the only road out of town, just as he'd instructed. I tried to shake off the unease, focusing on the road as it wound out of Ashbrook and back into the dense woods. But as I drove, a sense of dread began to build. The trees pressed in closer, the road narrowing, twisting. I kept driving, watching the odometer tick forward, sure that I'd left the town behind. Then, I saw it up ahead. The same sign, "Welcome to Ashbrook." The same buildings, the same quiet streets, and even the same diner, glowing softly in the dim light. I slammed on the brakes, my heart hammering. I'd been driving straight for at least 10 minutes, and yet here I was, right back where I'd started. I pulled over to the side of the road, staring at the diner, trying to make sense of it. The neon open sign flickered in the window, almost taunting me. I took a deep breath, telling myself I'd just made a wrong turn. I reversed, retracing my route, making sure to follow the road carefully this time, watching for any turns I might have missed. But after another 15 minutes of driving, the road looped again, depositing me back at the edge of Ashbrook. My chest tightened, and a cold sweat broke out on my skin. I was trapped. Somehow, every road led back here, as if the town itself refused to let me go. I drove around in circles, trying different routes, taking side streets, desperate to find an exit. But each road curved, twisted, leading me back to the main street, back to the diner. And each time I returned, I noticed something else. Figures, shadowy and indistinct, standing at the edge of the buildings, watching me. They didn't move or speak, just stood there, waiting, their faces hidden in the dark. I tried to ignore them, focusing on the road, but with each return to the town center, the figures grew closer, filling the sidewalks, lining the streets, their eyes fixed on me. My hands shook as I gripped the wheel, fighting the panic rising in my chest. Finally, I stopped the car in the center of the town square, gasping for breath, my heart racing. I looked around, seeing the figures now standing in every doorway, watching me in silence. And then, as I watched, they began to move, slowly stepping forward, closing in around me. I fumbled with the car door, practically falling out as I stumbled onto the street, backing away from the figures as they approached. Their faces were pale, eyes dark, empty, like they were hollow shells. I turned and ran, sprinting down the street, searching for any way out, any open door. And then I saw it. The old man, standing in front of the diner, watching me with those hollow eyes. "Please," I gasped, my voice shaking. "Tell me how to get out of here." He looked at me, a faint smile playing at the corners of his mouth. "There's only one way out of Ashbrook," he said quietly, "but it's not a road." "What does that mean?" I demanded, fear choking my voice. He tilted his head, his gaze cold and unfeeling. "Ashbrook only lets you leave if you're willing to give something up." My pulse pounded in my ears, and I backed away, shaking my head. I didn't understand, didn't want to understand. But then the figures closed in around me, their hands reaching out, their hollow eyes fixed on me with a hunger that made my blood run cold. I turned, running blindly through the streets, but every turn brought me back to the town square, to the diner, to the old man's waiting gaze. The clock on the diner wall struck 2:17, and the sound echoed through the empty streets, a low, mournful toll. The figures drew closer, their whispers filling the air, a soft chant that repeated over and over, wrapping around me like a shroud. "Welcome home, welcome home." I fell to my knees, the cold pavement pressing into my skin as I felt the darkness closing in, the town pressing down, suffocating me. And as the figures reached out, their hands cold and unyielding, I realized that there was no escape. I was part of Ashbrook now, just another soul lost to the town that only lets you in, but never lets you out.